Cycling for me has never been about the bikes. They've only ever been the prerequisite tool. I do not see just a bike race, I see riders on heroic journeys and warriors doing battle. At one point, cycling was the most popular sport in Europe because newspapers told magnificent tales about epic races and crafted the great champions into legends. But with the advent of television, cycling lost some of its mystique, and that golden age of journalism and narration has perished. So now let us try to return some romance to the beautiful sport. Let us praise and give glory to phenomenal performances to be remembered for decades to come. Let us dwell on the moments that inspire and move us. Let us chronicle the rise and fall of heroes. Let us chart these life-changing journeys, these cycling odysseys. All right, welcome back to another episode of Cycling Odysseys. I'm your host, Patrick Santino. We got what I think is a really exciting one today. This is one, let's put it this way. This is one I wanted. This is one I wanted to tell. You'll pick up quickly. Obviously, I just wrote this now. But hence the rewind title. We're throwing back one of the first, when I thought of this show, I wanted to do, how would I say it? Cover the current races, but then also pay homage to all the great ones of the past. This is a pretty special one to me. I'll try to explain a little bit more why afterwards, but we're rewinding 2013. This was written January 25th, 2022. So we're looking back, obviously, and that's overtly in it, but just go along with that, and I'll talk about it a little bit more after this. Thank you for listening, everybody. Vive la cyclisme. Rewind. 2013 Men's Elite Cyclocross Worlds. A race of yore. It was the first ever Cyclocross World Championship on American soil. In 2013, in Louisville, Kentucky, the greatest stars of cyclocross assembled. Marianne Vos had already won her 6th world title with relative ease to dash the hopes of the home nation hero, the American Katie Compton. A much younger Mathieu van der Poel had won the men's or boys junior world title. And in the men's under 23s, Mike Tunison had bested a certain Wout van Aert and others to win the world title. All that remained then was to squeeze in the Men's Elite World Championship race. Though the conditions were frosty frozen, icy, and wind chilly, the course was under threat of flooding. There was no time to delay. A winner must be crowned, a rainbow jersey donned, and then the course must be evacuated. The front row of the starting grid was mobbed by the fresh powder blue jerseys of the Belgian national team and their stellar lineup. Yes, it was one of those years where to be the Belgian champion was about as difficult as to be the world champion. To list all those mighty Belgians would be a bombardment of names and redundant, for so many were about to take a starring role. Only the Netherlands' young wonderkid Lars van der Haar and France's Francis Moret were allowed to intrude the Belgian front row. All disrobed their outer layers. Perhaps it was all nerves with less than a minute to go until the most important race of the year began, but all looked extremely chilled. The 2013 helmets were noticeably more bulky and not very aero, but instead airy, to the point all had warm headwear beneath. The eyewear was not flashy, and most notably the bikes appeared to feel more rigid and less sleek and durable than they are today. But none of this deterred the Belgians from getting out to the usual ferocious start. In fact, the start was more ferocious than I am accustomed, for a strange reason. The dominant generation of Belgians I was watching was the generation above the one I grew up with. As said, the Mighty Aces and all their supporting cast, save Lars van der Haar, were in the lower ranks not yet come to maturity. I myself am of a very similar age to the Mighty Aces, and I began watching cyclocross as they began the rise in the elites. Thus, To watch the replay of these 2013 World Championships, I felt in every respect like a second grader watching the big and strong 8th graders above me. The older generation of Belgians looked physically bigger, looked incredibly more talented and driven, looked like untouchable masters that I and the generation of mighty aces would always aspire to emulate. Even though Lars van der Haar was already in this race, even though the cyclocross world was only 2 years away from the first Mighty Ace Men's World Elite Championship victory, still, this was truly a far blast from the past. It was almost as nostalgic for me as those early Cavendish tours where the Schlecks, Contador, and Cadel did battle in the high mountains, a la my 4 days of introduction stage 1 report. These were days of yore, even though arguably today's cross scene is better in every respect. In 2013, only one man had the skill and equipment to bunny hop the barriers. None of the riders could transcend or at least mesh cyclocross with a proper road season, and though it could not be noticed, the fitness and speed of racing was not as intense as it is today. But as said, that last point could not be noticed, and the other observations were entirely negated by this looking up to the bigger kids, upper generational effect. These were yet another strong generation of Belgians, and they were as deep and strong as any Belgian cyclocross generation that had come before. And yet, as the early race developed, it was the French Yore that stole a march and played the spoiler against the crop of mighty Belgians. After the second lap of racing, Francis Yore was solo with a 14-second lead on a group of 4 Belgian chasers with 1 Czech rider for good measure. The course was layered with a thin blanket of snow, but everywhere, especially at the center of the track, it was being beaten down into slippery mud. Yes, it was one of those days where the riders' front sides were becoming indistinguishable with mud. As always, the elite men made most of the riding look easy, but every once in a while, one would make a mistake, and we were reminded just how hard a course this really was. On a sweeping right turn, Francis Yore, solo in the lead, wiped out, and the entire right half of his body was splattered with mud. The conditions looked grisly cold and grim, but already with more than a quarter of the race done, surely the riders were warm engines with massive fires burning within their chests. The fall did not seem to cost Yore much time, nor perhaps not even much energy or injury, for on he pushed, leading and animating the race, the man who would upset and overturn the Belgian dominance. After 3 laps, the organizers officially determined the race would be 9 laps in total. Yore still had some 12 to 20 second lead on the closest chasers. On that 4th lap, the quartet of Belgians really began to put the pedal to the metal, for Yore had thrown down the gauntlet. They chased, the 4 of them, Kevin Pauwels, Niels Albert, Klaus van Tornout, and Sven Nys. It could not be said there was much Belgian team allegiance this day, but perhaps if they themselves could not win, they did wish a fellow compatriot the best. On and on the 4 chased Frenchman Yore and put on a cyclocross masterclass clinic. They had the smoothest of dismounts and remounts, the finest of balance for the trickiest of sections. Their fundamental mechanics while pedaling and running with a shouldered bike were flawless. And on the finishing straight, at the end of the 4th lap, Kevin Pauwels was the first one to draw even with Francis Yore, who was out front solo no longer. Sven Nys and Klaus van Tornout came across the line 5 seconds behind with 5 laps to go, and Niels Albert was within 6 seconds of them and only 11 seconds behind the leading pair. The race was half over, but there was still all to play for. Soon within half a lap by the staircase bridge, Nys and Van Tornout had caught the leading pair of Yore and Pauwels, and still Niels Albert chased down behind them all. Yore still rode on the front, picking his line and keeping the clearest view, but the Belgians ominously followed, like Colombians easily in control on the early slopes of a high mountain climb. The 4 came across the finish line together. Niels Albert was still 11 seconds behind, and that gap was now proving to be a no man's land to cross. Any part of the body vertically above the wheels were now fully covered in mud from the spray of their own wheels and from the rider in front. It was a point in the race where all viewers were simply mesmerized by the performance of the leading quartet, but were also attentively looking for any telling signs of fatigue or wondering how the 4 leaders would handle the next technical challenge of the course. Even early French leader Yore still looked up to the challenge, and behind, Niels Albert was finally clawing back the gap to reach Sven Nys riding in 4th. Yes, a finely balanced battle on such a fair testing course, with historic grades from the generation above, and a loud and rowdy Louisville crowd. These really were days of yore. But within an instant, disaster befell one of the leading Belgians. Kevin Pauwels had some sort of drop chain. He tried refastening it, but it was very jammed, or his dexterity was too frozen. For despite how hot of a fire burned within him, surely his outer appendages were still being bitten by the bone-chilling cold. Pauwels managed to get the chain back on, but how many seconds had he already shipped to his generational rivals? By the time Pauwels got going again, across the finish line, Sven Nys and Klaus Van Tornout were charging with only 3 laps left to race. Yes, the camera did not capture how or where, but Klaus Van Tornout and Sven Nys had managed to find separation from Belgian Niels Albert 11 seconds back and Frenchman Francis Moret 20 seconds back. In fact, in between Moret and Albert, the young wonderkid Lars van der Haar had inserted himself into 4th place on course, though the Dutch orange uniform was almost impossible to pick out, for he was so covered in mud. Finally, behind many competitors now in between, Kevin Pauwels took absolutely ages, almost 2 minutes, to get to the finish line. For again, the chain dropped at the start of the final straight. Alas, alas, one Belgian's world title hopes were entirely dashed. But the Belgian pair up front, Klaus Van Tornout and beloved Sven Nys, were shifting this race into the very end game. They were throwing down and pushing the pace, trying to ensure no chasers were coming back again. Klaus Van Tornout had recently reached what was to that point the summit of his career. Only weeks before, he had won the Belgian Nationals for the first time. He had once before been on the World Championships podium. In 2010, he was the runner-up. Could this now be the culmination of his career, where he would go one place better than that to earn a rainbow jersey to hang alongside his Belgian champion's driecolor? Van Tornout had only one rival now standing in his way, but what a rival he was. The chosen one of cyclocross. The one that was the best bike handler in the world. The one that was the first, and at that point only one, to regularly be bunny hopping the barriers. And the one who was the most technically flawless running, suitcasing, and shouldering the bike. Yes, astronauts have Armstrong, the Jews have Moses, the Romans Augustus, and the NBA Jordan. But cyclocross has Sven Nys, the cannonball from Baal. By this point, Sven Nys was deep into his career and had already been around and been the perennial favorite for ages. As far back as 1996, Sven Nys had raced against Mathieu's father, Adrie van der Poel, at the peak of his cyclocross powers. And by 2013, Nys had done it all. He had won everything in the sport. Numerous cyclocross series general classifications, hundreds of wins, 8 times the Belgian champion, and he had been the world champion once before. But that brings up the stinger. The perennial favorite, the greatest bike handler ever, the cannibal from Baal, the cannibal implying the GOAT, the greatest of all time. How? How could someone acclaimed to be the GOAT of the sport only have one world title? And that world title was already a distant memory. Not since 2005 had Sven won his only world championship. Yes, Sven Nys may have already been the messiah of cyclocross by this point in his career, but another world title would now go a very long way in cementing his GOAT legacy. Sven Nys knew all these implications as he found himself in race-winning position this day. Thus, he was as hungry and desperate as Klaus Van Tornout to win this race, this world championship. It was a classic duel, mano-a-mano, toe-to-toe, pedal stroke for pedal stroke. Sven was more efficient and fundamentally sound up the staircases. He was bunny hopping over the barriers, and he was setting and driving the pace. But still, Klaus Van Tornout followed Sven's wheel. Sven got a gap by the end of the penultimate lap, but Klaus scrambled to close him down again in time before the gap got too alarming. The two passed through the finish to start the penultimate lap with a 24-second gap on the now pair of Belgian Niels Albert and young Dutchman Lars van der Haar. But the story was the two up front. The Belgian colors could still be seen on their clean upper backs, but their shoulders were rocking. Their legs were smashing the pedals. Every inch of this course was tiring torture, and even the freezing temperatures were quickly fatiguing them both too. The weather was growing more severe. The gray skies were growing darker as the flakes fell harder and visibility was reduced. Both were still up for this, though. When the first one turned for the pit, so did the second. They were synced in a rhythm. Klaus even came to the front and pushed the pace further. But only one could win. Over the barriers, Klaus in front dismounted to hurdle the set on foot, while Sven bunny hopped, literally rolled into the lead, and then put in a dig. But Klaus remounted, accelerated, and still did not let Sven get away. A minute later, Klaus even accelerated to take the lead and control the front and dictate the pace. The two were proving equals this day as they took the bell for the final lap, but only one of them could win. Where would the separation come? Who would create or find it? Who would make a costly mistake, however so minor? Who would win in a sprint if it came to it? Who would be the champion of the world? They rounded the early turns and bumps together, while the snow visibly fell even harder. Sven's back wheel almost slid out on him, but he kept it upright and they took the first small staircase together. They took the next sections almost gingerly, surely both to avoid technical mistakes and because of freezing fatigue. But the next staircase that formed an elevated bridge, both still adeptly dismounted, climbed the steps carrying the bikes like suitcases, and remounted as if it were only the first lap of racing instead of the last. Klaus was on the front, with Sven Nys in his wheel as they rounded the turn to approach the pit. Would Klaus pit? Would Sven follow? Klaus was on trajectory to do so, but at the last second, he switched out and forewent the last bike swap despite the mud and snow, and Sven Nys had not taken the bait. He was glued to Van Tornout's wheel. He also would ride out this last half lap in whatever condition his bike was currently in. Still, Klaus led up and across the technical off-camber, and both nailed the 180 turn out of it onto a section of pavement. Nys accelerated from second position around the outside and took the lead on the next right turn as they plunged down a slope to the bottom of the biggest staircase on course. Nys turned into and onto the staircase first, fully shouldered the bike, and was a second or two quicker up the stairs. But still Van Tornout, who was only suitcasing the bike, was within sneezing distance of him. At the top, Sven flawlessly remounted at the switchback right turn that plunged right back down the same hill they had just run up. But as Klaus Van Tornout, one bike length behind, planted the bike back onto the ground and was about to remount, he was too close to the inside barrier pole at the apex of the turn. Van Tornout's pedal, or derailleur, snagged on the pole and fencing for no more than a second. But that was all Nys needed. It caused Van Tornout to hesitate another second to remount. The gap grew from one bike length to 3, and Sven Nys in front could sense he was free to fly. He sent it into overdrive as Klaus Van Tornout scrambled with all his might to latch back on, but this race was over. Sven Nys sent it on a flat power section that led past the last pit of the race. Sven bunny hopped the barriers and held all his speed, handled the 4 little rollers, flew down a stretch of pavement, nailed the last off camber, powered up the last big hill, descended, and carried his speed up the last hill of the whole course where at the very top he did indeed need to put a foot down, but it only cost him half a second, and his lead to the desperately chasing Van Tornout was now about a full 3. Sven powered across the last connecting grassy section and then swung onto the pavement of the final straightaway. He got out of the saddle to put in one last finishing push, then put in a second push just for good measure before sitting up to celebrate. Posting up with arms raised, face caked with mud, and the Belgian team colors, Sven Nys, the cannibal from Ball, cemented his GOAT legacy and took his second cyclocross world title. All right, so I've talked in the past, especially in the 4 days of introduction stuff, how influential the 2010 Tour de France is. It's really all of those Cavendish tours, those early ones where he was with HTC from like 2008 or 9 through 2012. I know he was with Sky at that point, but whatever. It was really all those races that really laid the foundation for me to really love cycling, and then it really took off in 2013 and 2014, surprisingly, because those years weren't quite as good, actually. But that's another story. In cyclocross terms, I started watching in the fall of 2015, and I'm a couple months older than Wout van Aert and Van der Poel. So I started watching cross, and I'd seen headlines of them for a year, and that these guys are really good at cyclocross. And it's like, I don't know why cyclocross exists. Why don't they just mountain bike? But then anyways, after I was in like the full swing of watching the whole cycling calendar and stuff, and so then it's like, man, this winter break is pretty long. So I tried to give cyclocross a try, and at that point you had to find the pirated feeds of everything, and You had to watch at exactly the time. But anyways, it was, I fell in love with it because it was super fun to watch Van Aert and Van der Poel. And, you know, I picked Van Aert because he had lost the 2015 Worlds, but he had been coming back because he had more flats and everything. So it's like, all right, he's the slight underdog of the two, so I'll pick him. And then I also ended up like, I love them both. But Wout's my favorite because he really just never throws in the towel, and it's pretty damn sweet. I mean, he rides until oblivion. So anyways, that's them. But that's the time period that I'm starting to get into this. And so like as that first world championship I was ever going to see started to creep up, I tried to get a feel for what the other ones were like. And by that point, it was still kind of fresh in the minds that I had heard, man, if only I had gotten into this 2 years earlier, I could have gone to Louisville to watch this cyclocross race. Because, I mean, at that point, I was going to school in Ohio. So, I mean, it was pretty close. Like, I could have done it. And so anyways, I looked on YouTube. They had the race. And I vaguely knew who Sven Nys was. Like, I had heard he was the best in like GCN videos and everything. And so it was pretty cool to see this race, the whole thing. And it was a very good race in itself. A non-obvious or bias score, you would say it's probably, I don't know, in the nines, low nines, maybe mid nines, low to mid nines. But with the mystique of like the snow, the powder blue uniforms, the low visibility, the significance to Sven's career, and this was like a very late victory in his career, I guess, a big victory in his career, obviously. It was pretty cool. It was something else. It's a 10 out of 10 for me. I mean, this is one of those, like I said, Days of Yore race. I thought it was pretty weird as I was writing it because I was commenting originally just, man, bikes 8 years later, they already look pretty out of date, and all the gear and stuff. But then I watched them start and it's like, yeah, wow, these look like the big kids I was scared of in grade school. When I was like I said, when I was in second grade and I looked at the eighth graders, they were the biggest people in the world and they were scary and intimidating and like, whoa, that's someday who I might be like or whatever. Obviously, I never thought I would be a cyclocross superstar by any means. Like I'm the worst bike handler in the world, but it was always fun cheering for Wout and Mathieu, and so then it was, they're similar age, so that's kind of, you get what I'm saying with the feelings and everything. I feel like anybody that got to this point could probably relate. All right, if you're listening at this point in this show, you could probably relate to what I'm saying. So this one was really fun. It was a special one to write. It was one of those things I said, man, when I start this show, I want to get this race. I want to do the American one before the second American one comes up, the World Championships, and so like, I really didn't think I was going to have time to squeeze this one in, but I did, and I did it, and I'm happy about that. Thank you for listening, everybody. Vive le cyclisme.